This is the first lecture on the integumentary system. The integumentary system covers the body, consists of the skin and all the accessory organs such as nails, hair, sweat glands, sebaceous glands, tactile sensors in the skin, temperature sensors, and so on. Integument is our skin. It's also called the cutaneous membrane, and it's a barrier to the outside world. It's both a physical and a chemical barrier that helps to protect us. And if you want to study the skin, then you want to become a dermatologist. The integument is the body's largest organ. It's about 7 to 8% of your entire body weight. So it's the largest by weight and by surface area. It's composed of all kinds of tissues functioning together. There's a surface layer of epithelial tissue. There's underlying connective tissue. There's muscular tissue and nervous tissue present. And the thickness of the integument depends on where it's at in the body. The top layer of the cutaneous membrane is going to be our epidermis. It's made out of stratified squamous epithelial tissue. And then just below that, we're going to have the dermis, which is the deeper layer. The dermis is mostly connective tissue, but there's also a subcutaneous layer made out of mostly adipose tissue that lies underneath it, also known as the hypodermis. The dermis contains all of the fun things: hair follicles, sebaceous glands, eccrine sweat glands, temperature and pain and touch sensors, and that's kind of where all the action is. So if we look at the epidermis, it's this layer here, and as you can see, the border of the epidermis and the dermis is not even, and there's a good reason for that, and it's okay. Just I want you to realize that that's there. The dermis lies below the epidermis, and it contains things like the hair follicles, Pacinian corpuscles, sebaceous glands, eccrine sweat glands, nerve endings, blood vessels. So all of that fun stuff is down inside of the dermis, which we can divide into the reticular layer, which is basically all of this, and then the papillary region, which is a lot smaller. So the epidermis is the top part, the epithelial layer of the integument, and it's made out of layers of keratinized, stratified squamous epithelial cells. We've divided them into specific layers or strata, and from deep to superficial, they are the stratum basale, the stratum spinosum, the stratum granulosum, the stratum lucidum, and the stratum corneum. The first three layers are made out of living keratinocytes, and the outer two layers are made out of dead cells. The stratum lucidum is not always present. In fact, it's only present in thick skin such as the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. So let's start off with the stratum basale. It's the deepest of the epidermal layers. It's right on top of the papillary region of the dermis. It's also known as the stratum germativatum, or the base layer. It's a single layer of cuboidal cells, and they're very, very metabolically active and reproduce very rapidly. And as they do so, the older cells get pushed up and migrate through all of the different layers until they eventually end up in the stratum corneum, where they're going to be dead and then eventually be sloughed off of the body. There's basically three kinds of cells that we're going to find out in the stratum basale. The most abundant are going to be the keratinocytes, making that tough waterproof protein called keratin. There's also going to be melanocytes and some tactile cells. So the keratinocytes, as I mentioned, are the most abundant. They're found in all the layers of our epidermis, but they start down in the stratum basale. They're very large stem cells, and they're going to divide and regenerate, and as they do so, as I mentioned, the older ones will get pushed up toward the surface and eventually die. So by continuously regenerating our epidermis, we can regrow our skin. As we synthesize our keratin, remember that keratin's that tough protein, there's a whole little family of keratin-type proteins called cytokeratins that are found in the epidermis, and they also make our skin pretty much waterproof. The melanocytes are scattered in among the keratinocytes, and they produce and store a pigment called melanin. This is in response to ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet light can damage DNA. Melanin acts as a shield or an umbrella to help protect the DNA from ultraviolet light. the more ultraviolet light your skin is exposed to, the more melanin you will make. And this is responsible for part of our skin color. The stratum basale also has some nerve endings. These are called tactile cells or Merkel discs. And the drawing that you see over to the right is a little odd. What we've done is we've blacked out almost all the other tissue and left only those tactile cells. So the little red petals that you see there are going to actually be what we call the Merkel discs. They're the pressure sensors, and then the green stem is going to be a nerve. So as we stimulate those Merkel discs, when we compress them, they release chemicals, and those chemicals will in turn stimulate the nerve ending, which fires an electrical signal up into the brain, and then you know you've been touched in a certain area of the body. Just up from the stratum basale is the stratum spinosum, or the spiny layer, called so because of its spiny appearance on a microscope slide. These are daughter cells from the stratum basale that are a little bit older and have been pushed up into this layer. And they're going to be specialized and no longer divide. They've kind of made their decision now. They're keratinocytes, and they're going to be making keratin. The stratum spinosum also has some what we call dendritic cells. These are tissue macrophages. These used to be a white blood cell called a monocyte that migrated into the tissue, and because they ended up in the skin, they get a special name called the cells of Langerhans, or dendritic cells. It's a type of immune system cell that responds to pathogens and likes to eat bacteria and viruses and things like that. Up from the stratum spinosum is the stratum granulosum. This is a darkly staining area, typically on your slides. It's only 3 to 5 layers thick. And this is where the cells start to produce so much keratin that their function is impeded. It's kind of like my garage. I've got so much junk in my garage now that I can't park my car in my garage, so the garage can no longer do its normal function. So these cells fill up with so much keratin that they can no longer do normal cellular repair, and they're starting to die. So the stratum lucidum is the one that's not always present. It's 2 to 3 cell layers thick. It's found only in the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet and our thick skin. And it produces a protein related to keratin, but it turns out that this intermediate protein is actually going to be translucent. That's what lucid means, is translucent. And it's, if you ever had calluses on your hands or feet, this is the stratum lucidum. The stratum corneum is the very outermost of the layers. Corneum is horny, so the stratum corneum is the horn-like layer, thinking like a rhino horn, which, by the way, is made out of keratin. The stratum corneum is the most superficial layer of our cutaneous membrane. It's what you see when you look at your skin or other people. It's about 20 to 30 layers of dead tissue. The cells are anucleate. They've lost their nucleus. They're tightly packed together, and they're no longer functioning because they're so full of keratin and so far away from blood and glucose and oxygen that they're now dead. But that's okay, because remember, you're always continuously making new cells down at the stratum basale, and they'll eventually get pushed up, and old ones die. If you damage some of them, you can always grow more from the stratum basale, assuming you still have a stratum basale. The stratum corneum continued. The keratinocytes are going to migrate up from the stratum basale, as I mentioned, and it takes anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks to go all the way from the stratum basale up to the stratum corneum. And they're going to undergo structural changes along the way. As I mentioned, they're going to lose their nucleus. They're going to fill up with keratin. And eventually, as they're dead, they can no longer maintain their structural integrity. They can no longer repair themselves, and they'll tend to either get knocked or get sloughed off. This is actually good because of this layer of dead tissue. It's harder for germs to infect us. There are secretions also produced by the dermis that help to discourage infections. So here's a nice picture. On the left, we have a microscope slide. On the right is a diagram. So you can kind of see how that epidermis is pretty thick here. It's not just this upper layer, that's just the stratum corneum. If we get a better color here, this dark layer that you see right here, that's the stratum granulosum. As I mentioned, it's darkly staining. And then the single layer of cells right at the very bottom is going to be our stratum basale. And then basically anything in between the stratum granulosum and the stratum basale is going to be the stratum spinosum. And then everything above the stratum granulosum is usually going to be the stratum corneum, unless, of course, we're looking at the palms of your hands or the soles of your feet, where we could have some stratum lucidum show up. Now, depending on where we find the epidermis, we're going to have some variations. As I mentioned, we'll sometimes have the stratum lucidum or not. We also have variations in thickness of epidermis between individuals, and there's also differences in color and in skin markings. Thin skin covers most of the body. It lacks that stratum lucidum. It also contains sweat glands, hair follicles, sebaceous glands. So we can see here. Here again is our stratum basale. Single row of cells here. This is pretty thin. If you look here, we've got all these kind of dark purple cells. This is going to be mostly the stratum spinosum with the stratum granulosum right on top. And I know you say, but I thought the stratum corneum was on top. Well, it is. It's just that this particular skin is very thin, and the stratum corneum has mostly been sloughed off or knocked off in the process of creating the slide. When we look at skin color, there's a couple of pigments that make the color. There's melanin, of course. There's also hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the red pigment that carries oxygen in our blood, and it does color our skin. If you've ever seen someone who's flushed or looking kind of pinkish, that's the hemoglobin. There's another pigment called carotene. This is different from keratin. Carotene is orange. It's what makes carrots orange. Melanin is what gives skin a darker color, black or brown or tan, a little bit less, and you'll get some yellow to brownish shades. And it varies depending on what kind of melanin is being produced. Pretty much everybody's got the same number of melanocytes, but there's two different kinds of melanin that can be produced. And darker skinned individuals produce more of the darker colored melanin, is all. So skin color is just a pigment of your imagination. Here you can see we've got a melanocyte over on the left right here, and it is producing melanin granules, which are then being pushed into some of the surrounding keratinocytes. And that's going to help shield their nuclei from the effects of ultraviolet radiation. Albinism is a inherited condition. It's genetic, where the enzyme to make melanin isn't functional. So you can see here this young African woman, all her peers are kind of in the background. You can see their skin is very dark, where hers is really light, and that's because she can not make the dark kind of melanin. In this case, because her DNA is not shielded from the harmful effects of ultraviolet radiation, she's at a much higher risk of skin cancer. Now, the individuals with albinism are going to have very light colored hair, pale pink skin, and irises. And we don't have anybody who's completely white, because if hemoglobin isn't working, then you're not alive. So even albinos have hemoglobin going for them. Carotene, as I mentioned, is kind of that yellowy to orange pigment. We get it from a lot of orange vegetables. It accumulates in subcutaneous fat. It's converted to vitamin A by the body, and that's important for vision and reducing free radicals. It's an antioxidant. If you have a local collection of melanocytes that are kind of growing a little bit fast, then you can have what's called a nevus, or a mole. This is harmless. They hardly ever become malignant. The danger is that if there is a malignancy, you don't notice it for a while because you've always had a spot right there. Freckles, again, are just a local accumulation of melanin within the tissue. Hemangiomas are discolorations in the skin due to benign blood vessel tumors. You can have capillary hemangiomas, which are bright red to purple. They're usually present at birth and disappear in childhood. So if somebody has like a strawberry colored birthmark, that disappears, and that's what we're looking at here. Cavernous hemangiomas are formed from larger dermal blood vessels and can last a lifetime. So port wine stains are an indication of that. Now, when we look at thick skin, we have something called friction ridges. There's little tiny pegs, if you will, in thin skin. And what happens is they're going to help the layers adhere to each other. But as the skin grows and moves, these pegs kind of limit the movement on the thicker skin, and that's going to cause it to get, well, kind of wrinkled. And we call these wrinkles friction ridges. And since they appear kind of randomly, we use them as an identifier of individuals. So here are some fingerprints made by friction ridges. So if you look at your thumb, you're not looking at a fingerprint, you're looking at your friction ridges. And then if you put ink on your friction ridges and smash it on a piece of paper, then you've made a print with your finger, or a fingerprint. When we look at ultraviolet radiation, the sun produces several different kinds of ultraviolet radiation. UVC rays are absorbed by the atmosphere and don't actually reach the surface of the Earth. UVA and UVB does reach the surface of the Earth, but sunscreen will help to block them. You need a decently high SPF, or sun protection factor, to do so. Sunless tanners basically stain your skin without UV light exposure, but it's not going to protect your nuclei. It's not a replacement for melanin. So you might look tan, but you're just as at much risk for sunburn as somebody who's pasty white and never goes outside.